Welcome to Fort Worth 148's podcast, where we meet to discuss Masonic topics and strive to build value in the brotherhood. The opinions and statements of the participants do not represent any positions or stance of any Grand Lodge or Lodge and are solely the viewpoints of the participants.
Hello again, listeners, and welcome to the Fort Worth Masonic Podcast.
I am Billy Hamilton, past master of Fort Worth Lodge number 148.
And my name is Gabe, and I am also a past master of Fort Worth Lodge, and we have a special guest with us today.
Yes, my name is Robert Davis. I'm a past master of 3 lodges in Oklahoma.
All right, folks. Now, Brother Davis is the sitting Grand Master of the Grand Council of Cryptic Masons of Oklahoma, and he is also a past presiding officer of the other 3 bodies of York Rite Masonry, which in Texas and a few other states we like to call gents like Brother Davis a 4-star general. So he is in he's rare company to be able to enjoy. And among other things, Brother Davis is also a fairly prolific Masonic author. And so we're privileged to have him on the podcast today and to get an insight into who he is and what he does in Masonry and share that knowledge with you all. Now, Billy, I know that you have a kind of a very research-oriented perspective on Masonry, so I'm sure that you've been excited for this for a while.
Absolutely.
So we'll start with a few individual questions for you, kind of get a feel for you as who you are as kind of as an individual and as a Mason, not just as a I did this and I'm currently working on that. Just kind of get a feel for who is Robert Davis. And we'll start with a non-Masonic question. Can you tell us about yourself outside of the lens of Masonry?
Well, yes. First of all, I was born on a farm and ranch in northwest Oklahoma. I like to say that it wasn't the end of the world, but you could see it from where I lived. And it's known as shortgrass country. Billy knows about that. And I was born in the Masonic Hospital in a little town of Cherokee in 1948, and my father was a farmer and rancher, and he was very active. He was a very active Freemason, as was my uncle, his brother, and we had adjoining farms. And so, as long as I can remember, my dad would come in from work. He would take a bath, put on his Sunday suit, slap on Old Spice deodorant, and his brother would do the same and come by and pick him up. And they went to lodge on Wednesday nights, and they did that for 50 years. And so I can't remember when I was not going to be a Freemason because he was actively engaged in the fraternity throughout his adult life. And another thing that I observed was the town that was the closest to where we farmed was a little town of about 2,500 population. And over my boyhood, I got acquainted with the most respected men in that little town. And a number of those guys just kind of paid attention to me every time they would see me. And that's where we'd spend our, social conversations outside the home. It's where we attended church, and that's where the festivals, we went to all the festivals they had. And so I got well acquainted with those guys. And when I showed up for my entered apprentice degree, all those guys that I knew and respected were there. They were my father's friends. And so I like to tell this story because I'll never forget standing in the preparation room, duly and truly prepared, and waiting for someone to return the knocks on the door. thinking to myself, tonight I'm going to be initiated into manhood. There was absolutely no question in my mind that Freemasonry was all about the journey to manhood. Now, I didn't have any idea where that journey would take me, but my first impression was that I wanted to grow up to be like those men that I knew and respected in my youth. And so I think just having that experience early on gave me an unusual immediate perspective of what Freemasonry was about. And so I was in college at the time. I joined between two semesters, and I had to wait until I got my degrees and things before I got active. But anyway, that was in 1969, and so I've been a Freemason now for what, 53, 54 years, something like that. And I my education, I went to Oklahoma State University. It was the university that my brother graduated from veterinary medicine from. It was the university my sister graduated in music from. So I guess it was just kind of the university that was a part of our family. And I got my bachelor's degree in agricultural economics. And I decided to go ahead and continue my education with a master's degree, and I was awarded a graduate research assistantship in the area of econometrics and rural and regional economic development. And so I ended up getting a master's degree in economics, concentrating on econometrics, macroeconomics, and economics of the public sector. And so I can tell you another thing about my youth is that I said that we attended the festivals of our lives in that little town, and they had things for everybody in the family in these festivals, and they'd last all day long. And we would saddle up our horses and you know take them to town, and we'd ride in the parade in the mornings, and then they'd have a big public community feed out in one of their parks, and we'd graze our horses on the grass while we were eating, and they had all kinds of activities during the afternoon, and they'd usually end up with a rodeo, so we'd ride we'd ride in the rodeos and stuff like that. But I it was so well organized. I was always curious how that could happen. How could a community do things like that? And when I was 9 years old, I discovered that it was the city manager that made all of that happen. And I remember pointing at that man when I was 9 years old and saying, I want to be like that man because he makes a difference to everybody. So when I was 9 years old, I knew I wanted to be a city manager. And so that's what I did. When I graduated from college, I went to work first of all for a council of local governments. They called them sub-state planning districts, and back at that time you had to have a comprehensive plan before you were eligible for any federal grants. And so my job was to visit all the communities in an 8-county area and write their comprehensive plans for them. And of course, I also got pretty good at writing federal grants for them while I was at it. And so it was while I was serving on that council of governments that I got acquainted with the city manager of Enid. He was on the board of directors of that sub-state planning district. And he asked me if I would become the city planner of the city of Enid. And so I did that. And Enid was a town of about 50,000 population. And so I started out in city planning, and of course I wrote a comprehensive plan for the city of Enid, and land use plan, and then he reorganized that department into the Department of Community Development, and I was over planning, zoning, and code administration, and the library and the airport, and several departments like that. And then he elevated me to assistant city manager, and so I did that for 5 years or so, and then I became the city manager of that city. So I spent 14 years, my first 14 years of my life, in city planning and city management. And that of course, as you know, is a servant leadership position. And while I was doing that, I also got engaged in many of the nonprofit, kinds of organizations in the community, and ended up, serving on a number of community boards and committees, and I, you know, I, United Way, Chamber of Commerce, Community Industrial Foundations, Economic Development Organizations, civic clubs, Arts and Humanities Council. I even organized a youth arts group, and I was in childhood literacy organizations and civic clubs, arts and humanities councils, and just worked for the mentally handicapped group home board, and I had several, and I also had several state positions that I was able to serve on while I was in that profession. I was on the state of Oklahoma's Solid Waste Management Committee for the Department of Health. I was on the Technical Advisory Committee of the Oklahoma Department of Transportation. I was on the State Arts Council Grants Review Board, and I served as the governor's delegate to the Congress for Arts and Humanities, and so you can just imagine that I lived in a world of servant leadership. And so I've never had a job that wasn't a job that was engaged in service in that way. And in 1986, I just happened to be active in the Guthrie Scottish Rite. And that was about an hour's drive from Enid, and the lodge I belonged to in Enid had one of the active degree teams in the Guthrie Valley, and I got on that degree team. So
That's how
I
they
think
get you.
that's how they get you, yeah. And so I joined the fraternity in '69. I joined the Scottish Rite in '71, and did not go back until 1975 because I just had all these other things going on. But I've never missed a Scottish Rite reunion since 1975.
There you
So,
go.
yeah. Anyway, that's kind of my background.
Well, that's a pretty good background. It's kind of funny because one of the questions that we have here is, and these are questions that we put together in advance that we can throw at our guests. And, I really kind of like that. One of the questions is fairly early on. One of the questions was made moot, right? It's what inspired you to join, right? And
Yeah.
it's kind of neat because in your life, it seems like, you could say there's an inspiration, but there's no inspiration needed because from from your earliest memories, it was almost an inevitability that you would join, and
Yeah.
it's kind of neat to see that very positive role model of your dad and your uncle say, yeah, nope, this is what we do,
Right. Yeah.
Now you've had your fingers in all sorts of Masonic pies, right? So past Grand Master of the Grand Lodge, past Grand High Priest, past Grand Commander, sitting Grand Master of the Grand Council. And you're also very active in the Scottish Rite as well, in addition to a lot of the book writing that you do. What is your favorite aspect of Masonry, and why?
Well, oh boy, that
That's a
of
tough one.
course, yeah,
There's a lot to pick.
that has changed over time for sure. I um, I think that I got involved in writing about Masonry just out of my ignorance. Uh, you know, when I became a Mason, you know, one of the first things that I was curious about was just the history of Freemasonry. Where did it come from? How old was it? And so I kind of went down that path, and back in that time, it was very, very difficult, if not impossible, uh, to communicate with any Masonic scholars. We all lived pretty isolated lives in rural America, and I would ask Masons, local Masons, a lot of questions, and they were very, very nice men, and they were very, very honest with their responses. They say, "Brother Davis, we just enjoy the fellowship of men. We very much enjoy coming together, and we very much enjoy the ritual of the fraternity and being proficient in our degree work and things like that. But we don't know. We're not Masonic scholars. We don't we don't know any of that kind of stuff." And so I discovered that uh, at that time, if you wanted to learn about Masonry, you just had to do it on your own. And so I just started reading a lot of the 19th and 20th century books that were published about Freemasonry, and kind of became comfortable with the history. And then I really got curious about the language of the ritual. Where did it come from? Who were the primary authors? How old was it? How did it evolve? And again, I couldn't find anybody that really knew the answers to that. So I just started going down a path of researching that myself. And I discovered the Masonic Library in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, which in my opinion is the most significant Masonic library in the United States. I mean, we're talking about a library that is 4 stories, and they just had everything. And so I made a sojourn to Iowa on 2 separate occasions, and I spent a week on both occasions just researching in the Cedar Rapids library and just taking notes, making Xerox copies of everything. And they had all of the ritual exposés, English ritual exposés. They had everything you needed. And so I kept just writing these essays to myself as I would learn. And I discovered one day that, these essays, they sure would organize themselves into a book quite nicely. I could see how these essays could just become chapters as my research evolved. And so I actually wrote the Mason's Words probably 15 years before I published it, because I was afraid that if you were going to publish ritual language, you know, you could be brought up on Masonic charges for exposing the secrets of Freemasonry. And I remember talking to luminaries like Brent Morris and Art DeHoyos and Rex Hutchins, and they would say, "Bob, it's not a violation of your obligations if you cite an exposure that somebody else has written." And I still had a hard time accepting that. But an interesting thing happened in that 15-year period, and that was the internet. All of a sudden, you could find all the rituals of Freemasonry on the World Wide Web, and Grand Lodge officers and the authorities of Freemasonry discovered that too. And there was kind of a transition that took place where everybody kind of decided that the things that we used to call the secrets of Freemasonry are really no longer secret because they've been exposed everywhere. And so that's when I decided to go ahead and publish the book, The Mason's Words, and it turned out to be it was really well received. And I'm not saying it's the definitive work, but it gives a really nice structure of the history and evolution from the Scottish operative lodges through English Freemasonry and how that came to the colonies and how that spread westward through the traveling lectures and that sort of thing. And so that was the inspiration for that book. Now, another inspiration was the book that another thing that I was interested in and curious about that became Manhood in America, Understanding Manhood in America, because it also occurred to me that there weren't any books about manhood. You know, when I'd go to libraries, there were all kinds of books on women's studies, and about the only books that you could find in libraries that related to men would be, you know, gay issues and that sort of thing. And it just kind of occurred to me, how do men know anything about manhood? I mean, there's no defining moment in a man's life when he knows that he's become a man. And to me, there was a clear distinction between males and females in that regard, because with women, you know, they go through the menses cycle, and you know, their body changes in physical appearance. It's a very emotional and dramatic part of their young life. They inherently take on a degree of accountability and responsibility for their gender because they know they can have babies, and you can see the physical changes in their bodies, but none of that happens to men. There's no defining moment for men when they can say, I'm a man. And so that kind of led me into the same kind of research journey on what is a man, what is manhood about, how do you define manhood, and that's when I discovered that Freemasonry is not only the journey to manhood, but it's actually the journey to the mature masculine, and of course, even more specifically, a journey to the mature masculine soul. And so I think, again, out of my ignorance, I ended up writing a book on understanding manhood, just as a way to inspire men to think about being men and what it means to be a man. And what are the guideposts for manhood that can lead you to become a respected man? And so that's kind of what led me to that book, and that was actually the first book I published before the Mason's Words. And so I think um, that's just how I have educated myself. Now, in recent years, you know, we got podcasts going all the time. You know, esoteric Masons have discovered each other on the World Wide Web, and now we're connected with our specific interest groups, and so it's much easier than it used to be. But so that's kind of, and then the other thing that happened to me was, you know, in the Blue Line, the craft degrees, in the Scottish Rite degrees, and in the York Rite degrees, we're dealing with archaic language, and we're dealing with a structure of words that we no longer use in our vocabulary. And I felt like that there must have been a disconnect between the ancient teachings of the fraternity and how they are applied to contemporary men. And that sort of led me down the path of interpretive studies on the meanings behind the ritual language. And then I made a couple of other interesting discoveries, and that ties into this journey of manhood, and that is, what is the quest of the Symbolic Lodge and the overall journey of manhood? What's the quest in the Scottish Rite 4 lodges, and what's the quest in the York Rite? And I think it is very important that men understand that Freemasonry and the ritual instruction Freemasonry takes them on a quest, and it's nothing less than the hero's journey. And every aspect of the monomythic hero's journey that Joseph Campbell wrote about so eloquently, you know, are clearly represented in the degrees and the themes of Freemasonry. And so that kind of led me to write a book on the journey of the Elu to enlightenment, going through the four quests of the Scottish Rite, and then also what did the York Rite degrees contribute to the quest themes. And so that's how I ended up becoming an author, I guess.
I love that. That's a kind of a amazing sort of way to approach that. Hey, I didn't understand it, so I learned it, and here's my notes. It's
Exactly.
kind of a great, very practical way.
Yeah.
It's a very practical approach to authorship, and I really like that. One of the things that you said that's kind of sticking with me right now is that you were there in the preparation room, and you knew that in that moment, this is how I become a man, right? It's that you were in that liminal space, right?
Mhm.
That you're about to experience that initiation into manhood. And it's something that we've talked about on the podcast, actually. You brought it up that women have a very inherent biological initiation into womanhood and stuff, and men have to kind of construct their initiation into manhood. Um, and one of the key concepts in your book, understanding manhood in America, is that you have to kind of rise above in order to understand this whole process and understand how you become a man. There's a few questions that spiral out for me from that. I guess the first one would be, what do you think the effects are of Masonry and other initiatic orders being kind of one of the only structured initiations into manhood in the West, and what effects do you think that has on our culture as men?
Mhm. Well, I think first and foremost, men have to be initiated into manhood by older men, and uh, and your initiation into manhood is going to be a function of the kind of men that you're attracted to, and so every man has to be initiated into manhood, and he's going to be initiated into manhood by what he picks up from other men. And so he's either going to be initiated into a gang, or he's going to be initiated into a group of self-initiated men, or maybe he's going to be initiated into manhood through his service in the military. There's a lots of forms of initiation, but I think the secret societies have always existed to formalize that into a structure and a path that is progressive in its nature. And I think that has been the influence of secret societies on manhood. And of course, the problem is that, uh, you know, 98% of the men, don't take advantage of the instruction that's offered to us by these ubiquitous societies that have always existed to take care of this function for males. And and I think if men understood that that was what Freemasonry was all about, we would just inherently become immediately more popular. Because I think the only way that a man really becomes a man is through his association with other men. And the reason that Masonic lodges were created almost wholly uh, by an intergenerational model of men was as men had their own rites of passage. They moved from a student, from an initiate, a seeker to an initiate, to a master and then a teacher. And so our rites of passage as men change. And what older men need to understand is that their contribution to manhood is, of course, first and foremost, their examples as men, but secondly, in being mentors to the generations of men below them. And up until the Depression of the 1930s, that was an easy process for Freemasonry because sons always followed their fathers into the fraternity. That's the reason we never had to worry about membership recruitment for 250 years, because Freemasons understood that, that this was a journey to manhood. And so we had that, and what happened was that the three generations of males that lived in many homes prior to the Depression, those younger males had to leave and find jobs outside of the areas in which they were raised, and they didn't come back to those homes. And then World War II happened right after that, and literally a generation gap existed for the first time in the history of Freemasonry as a result of the Depression and World War II. And the baby boomers did not follow their fathers into the fraternity, and the men in the 20th century quit talking about Freemasonry as a result of World War II because they were afraid communism would infiltrate American institutions. And so they were told to board up their windows and not say anything to the outside world, because of that fear. And so we just kind of became a quiet fraternity that no longer had a public presence, and we lost touch. We lost touch with men. Now we're getting that back, fortunately, but I'm just saying that's a part of our history.
I think especially a lot of younger guys, guys my age and below, I'm considered to be kind of on the younger end of millennials, right? So I was born in 1991, and so I'm at the tail end of what's considered millennial. And now we've got these Generation Z, men, and Generation Alpha. Well, they're going to become adults soon, and so I think a lot of younger men are looking towards maybe institutions that their parents didn't look at, right? And they say, oh, hey, like this, once that it kind of clicks that, hey, maybe this is a path to manhood. I think a lot of younger guys do see masonry as kind of a viable way of becoming a man. Now, there's a cool concept that you touched on, the idea of manhood versus mature masculinity. And can you kind of elaborate on that?
Sure. And it has to do with the quest that we undertake when we begin this journey through our fraternity. And the the largest challenge, I think, for young men is developing an awakening consciousness, a sense of self-awareness. Uh, Men have a tendency just to live in the moment, and 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 guys are just really, really good at living in the moment, and they just, what's going on with their life in any given day is their life, and they're just kind of living it day by day, and they're not giving a lot of serious thought to themselves. Uh, they may be focusing a lot on their occupation. They may be learning all they can learn in the occupations that they have, and they kind of reach a point where they know everything that they want to know except themselves. They don't know themselves, and so I see the quest in the symbolic lodge degrees is a quest of awakening consciousness, and that is the first requirement of getting on the path to the mature masculine. you first of all have to become aware of, from whence you came, what has influenced your understanding of the world, and that is all a function of the family that you were raised in, the culture you were raised around, the education that you received, and all the biases and stuff that we deal with, and the ignorance that we deal with, and in learning about all that stuff. And we sort of have to stop at some point and kind of reevaluate what we know. And what have we learned that has validity to us and that's consistent with the values that we have, and what doesn't seem real to us. And that's a generational problem. And so I think Freemasonry does a really good job at identifying what awakening consciousness is, just through the teaching of morality and virtues that's within the language, that at least gets a man on a path of becoming a virtuous man. And so, and that's a process. That's not an event. I would argue that few men become an initiate on the night that they're initiated into the fraternity. That initiation is a transformative thing, and Freemasonry is a transformative art. So it's something that occurs over a period of time as your consciousness grows, and as you make the decision to kind of go inside yourself and discover who you really are. And men have to reach that point before they can understand the nature of the mature masculine. And even Masons, a lot of Masons don't ever reach that point. A lot of Masons just enjoy the fellowship of men. It's the number one psychological need in men is to have fraternal relationships with other men. And that's as far as some men choose to take it. But for the fellow that really wants to understand himself and grow in his learning about himself, he's the guy that's going to cross these various portals, and he's going to internalize. He's going to internalize those teachings, and once he starts internalizing the teachings, and then consciously applying them to his life, that's when he takes on the journey of mature masculinity. And the more that he gets in touch with his highest nature, that sense of spirituality that exists within himself, the more he gets in touch with that, the more he is driven to understand that the quest is really to discover the mature masculine soul, and my mature masculine soul. And so everything from that point forward, relates to how I nurture my soul in my application of life. And as long as I stay focused on nurturing the highest nature within myself, then I'm going to become transformed as a better human being, a better man, and everything that encompasses that. So it's a journey.
So part of that journey, you discuss in understanding manhood in America, right? And then another major component of that journey you describe in the journey of Elu, of the Elu to enlightenment, right? Where we look at this more classical hero's journey and how it applies to the self and manhood and stuff. What are the major differences you would say in the way that we approach to the that journey of self-discovery within the craft lodge versus how we approach that journey of self-discovery in the Scottish Rite and in the further bodies of the York Rite? How what's our difference in game plan here?
Sure. Well, I think the quest of the Blue Lodge is um, is awakening consciousness, and a part of that awakening consciousness is very dramatically represented to us in the drama section of the Master Mason degree, where we encounter these ruffians. And it's easy to think of the ruffians as somebody else. It's the old fairy tale story where, a good man, gets unjustly murdered, and eventually, the ruffians get caught and they're brought to justice. And so it ends like every other fairy tale's ever end. The good guy wins in the end. He kind of becomes our martyred hero. But the real lesson there that we have to take from the third degree is that we're dealing with the ruffians within ourselves, and every one of us have them. And so we have to identify what those ruffians are. And so the quest of the Lodge perfection, the degrees of the Lodge perfection, is the quest of self-discovery. And that's the reason we don't bring the ruffians to justice until the 9th and 10th degrees. The authors of the Scottish Rite felt like that we need to spend some time getting acquainted with the ruffians within ourselves. And so each of the degrees from the 4th through the 9th and 10th represent a different ruffian element. And it has to do with our passions, our prejudices, our ability to judge people on the merest of pretenses, our ability to judge people too quickly, our inadequate understanding of things, our lazy approaches to learning. I mean, there's many, many, many ruffians, and we all have them. And if we can't identify them, then we can't address them. And so it's really, really important that we understand we come to understand the worst nature of ourselves, sort of the secrets that we have within that we're kind of embarrassed about and sharing with other people. And because once we identify those, then we can bring them to justice. And the teachings of Freemasonry allow us a chance to release ourselves from our baggage from the past. The preparation room is the first portal to do that. We can leave the baggage of our past in the preparation room, and as we begin our journey, we can store them in the pillars in the Fellowcraft degree. We don't want to repress them, but we may want to just simply store them until we reach a point in our lives where we can deal with them as more mature individuals. We can look at them from a more objective point of view. So we can go back and revisit those ruffians, and then we can deal with them when we've developed the internal skills to do that. And but the important thing is that at some point in time, we need to put the ruffians behind us in our life, while understanding that they have a way of resurfacing, all the time, and they always will. But as long as we recognize that, then we can deal with them. They no longer control how we think about things and how we act on things. And so the quest in the Lodge perfection is this quest to self-discovery. And we discover this thing called the lost word, the thing that we lost in the degrees of the symbolic lodge, and we discover that whatever that is has to be found in the caverns of our own consciousness. And that means that we only find that has been lost by going within ourselves. And so, once we make this self-discovery, then the chapter of Rose Croix is the journey to light and knowledge, having having become aware of this, of our spiritual nature, how do we use that? That's very, very important. I mean, I love all the degrees of Freemasonry, but I would say, and I've had I've had a number of Masonic scholars agree with this, that probably the most important degree in Freemasonry is the 18th degree. Yeah, because that teaches us about the law of love. And so then, we launch into the Council of Kadosh degrees, and that covers actually the initiatic tradition. And one of the things that the Scottish Rite provides that the York Rite doesn't provide is this review of the ancient mysteries traditions. And we make this journey, we kind of review this journey of faith versus reason, and we reconcile and we balance, we balance those two concepts by applying both faith and reason in how we look at our spiritual nature. And so we take on then the virtues of knighthood, which is one of the archetypes of manhood. And so we go through the traditions of knighthood, and we become spiritual knights. And then the quest of the consistory is the quest of self-examination and empowerment. And so we always have an opportunity to review that long, hard path of self-examination that we have to maintain in our consciousness throughout our life, and so that we focus on what truth is and what truth means to us, and to ensure that we will live a life of truth that incorporates love. And so then in the 32nd degree, we go forth in the world to conquer. So, I mean, it's really worthwhile that people understand the elements of this journey, and all of those elements are extraordinarily important, and all of them together is what transforms us into better men, and hopefully makes us as older men exemplars that younger men want to follow. I never forgot how important those older men were to my young life, and that I wanted to grow up and to be like them. And I hope and pray that somebody out there wants to grow up and be like me, because I can be the same exemplar those guys were to me when I was young. And that's the nature of manhood. Yeah.
I love that. Now, one of the things that you mentioned that I think every Mason who's at least paying attention to the ritual kind of will pick up on is that a lot of the language that we use in our initiatory rituals is from a certain period of time, right? And depending on which rituals you're talking about and which bodies you're using, it might be from a different period of time or from an older period of time. But at some point, it seems like, in the Masons' words, you document the evolution of our ritual in the United States and how it's changed and evolved and grown. And it seems like at some point we put a pin in it. We said, this is kind of where we stop, right? This is as modern as we're going to let the language get. And obviously now, in different jurisdictions, the Grand Lodges and the Grand Bodies have prerogative as to changing the ritual, and they can make updates to it as, via, at least in the state of Texas, that gets proposed to the Grand West. There's debate, and we'll vote yay or nay on a resolution to add a line to the ritual or change a word or whatever. But it seems like there is like a little slice of a period of time. Do you think that this makes ritual less accessible or more accessible? Does it make it more special, or does it have any effects on the mind as we thrust a guy through the initiatory experience? Does the not the archaicness, but I guess there's a word for it, but the sense of the language being out of time, does that
Mhm.
have any effect on a man, more or less, or good or positive, or good or negative?
Yeah. Well, that depends on, I think it depends on the kind of mentorship that each man has. I think it's very, very important that uh, that we do not do anything with the ritual language of the fraternity. We just have to understand that the authors of the Masonic rituals uh, knew what they had in their hands, and they knew that the real teachings of the fraternity had to be hidden from the profane world. And because they knew that the rituals were going to be exposed in every generation of men. And so the genius of their art was that they hid everything beneath the words. And the young man is told that in the preparation room before he even becomes, you know, an entered apprentice. That Freemasonry is a what, I don't remember exact words, but Freemasonry is a school of allegory, veiled in symbols and represent, or veiled in hieroglyphics and represented by symbols or something like that. But he's told that in the very beginning. So the fact is that everything in the ritual language is allegorical. In other words, everything in the ritual language is hidden. And so we have to discover what that is. And the problem with changing the ritual, the problem with updating the ritual, if you don't know that the allegories are there and you change something, you may actually destroy a very, very important allegory. And so it's so my thinking is that we don't update the fraternity by changing the ritual language. I have absolutely no problem if we want to put contemporary images, with the old lantern slide images that were created in our, second and third section lectures. There's lots of ways that we can give images that relates more to contemporary men than in past generations. But the language has to be protected.
Well, and that makes sense to me because when you have language that is a bit archaic, not used in the common parlance, it forces you to think a little bit more about what it means. Right? You can't just take it at face value. You actually have to take time to parse it, and get a better understanding of it.
Yes, and one thing we're doing in Oklahoma this year is we're doing the middle chamber program that was created by the Grand Lodge of North Carolina some 7 years ago, and that is and that's one reason I wrote the latest book I wrote was In Search of Light. I wanted to focus on an interpretation of the allegories and symbolism that's within the craft rituals. And so, we just have to understand that, King Solomon is an allegory. Solomon's temple is an allegory. And so if you think you're going to use another temple, what kind of a temple is it going to be? If you think you're going to change the historical characters that are represented in the degrees, what are those characters going to be when those original characters represented an allegorical story themselves? And just everything you encounter as you go through the degrees, everything you encounter is a new allegory. And so if you don't understand the allegories, at least don't do anything to take them from us. Because especially, I think, the millennial generation of men and the generation following them, they're learning about Freemasonry on the World Wide Web, and they are interested in the hidden mysteries of Freemasonry. They want to be on a quest, and so we need to make sure that quest is available to them in the same way it was available to us. And we have such a better understanding about all that now than we did just 2 generations ago, that this gives us the possibility to see a renaissance. I mean, as you know, we're at a real tipping point right now in Freemasonry, and the bad news is that the young men, that the fraternity may die during the lifetime of the young men that are joining it today. It's just because our membership decline has become so pronounced that we can reach a point where we cannot recreate ourselves. And so we're on this race between our own demise and our own renaissance. And we have a greater opportunity to see the renaissance as we do to see our own demise. But we won't see the renaissance unless we make some fundamental changes and to our fraternity, and those changes have to be led by our knowledge of what Freemasonry is about.
Now, in order to enact that renaissance, in your opinion, right, and this is, and for our listeners, right, one of the things that we have kind of heard, in the past, hey, you guys are, brothers of the local lodge. Now we're past masters, right? But we're, the podcast hosts themselves are used to more local management, right? More, we're experimenting in the sandbox. But you've actually been there, and you've actually led the state bodies, and so you have a lot of boots on the ground experience, right? And so when Brother Davis, talks about this, he's coming from a real place of understanding, having been there and done that. So with that preface, in your opinion, in order to kind of kickstart that renaissance, to be the catalyst for the renaissance of Masonry, what are the steps that we need to be working towards or taking immediately? Either, I guess our 1 year, 3 year, 5 year, 10-year type goals. What are we looking to do?
Well, it's two things we have to focus on, of course, and one of them is we are going to have to focus on our survivability. We cannot deny that the long-term downward trend in membership is something that is going to take a real serious toll on the current structure of Freemasonry. I would say that in most grand jurisdictions, we will probably lose 40% of our lodges in the next decade. And I say that because every jurisdiction is primarily rural in nature. I mean, even New York, we think of New York, we think of New York City, but the rest of New York is rural. Pennsylvania has Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, and the rest of the state's rural. Oklahoma has Tulsa and Oklahoma City, and the rest of the state's rural. Texas has Dallas and Houston, So it's going to be very, very difficult for these small rural lodges to survive just because of the outmigration from those small communities. There's just not a pool of men like there once was. So one strategy towards survivability is we have to come to the understanding that we're going to lose lodges. And so what we need to try to do is end up with one active, viable lodge at every county of our state if possible. And if we can't make that happen at a county level, let's do it at a district level. One thing we know for sure that young men will travel longer to experience Freemasonry than the older generations men would. They didn't have to travel. Now they can't imagine travel 15 miles down the road to consolidate with another lodge. But lodge consolidation is an important strategy, and we need to pay attention to it. Uh, Grand lodges have to pay attention to it, because if lodges don't consolidate and they just end up dying, and the last man there just turns out the light, then the Grand Lodge inherits the properties, and they're all run down properties, and the Grand Lodge can't take on the liability of dying lodges. And so we've got to all develop an understanding that we're not going to have as many lodges as we once had. So let's make the best of the best lodges that we have moving forward. Now, another strategy is we need to replace lodges that are lost. And so we need to consider the model that's followed in almost every other Grand Lodge in the world. And that model is that every lodge is small in member numbers. I mean, I've looked at the Grand Lodge membership of every Grand Lodge in the world. I've looked at the number of lodges in every Grand Lodge in the world, and the average number of members is between 25 and 50. And so the European model is, you should create as many lodges as you want to create, and all of those lodges should be created as affinity lodges. They should exist for like-minded men who have things in common outside of Freemasonry, so that their discussions have relevance, their social conversations have relevancy, just because they're in the same general occupations or whatever. And so, we need to have lodges of people in law enforcement, lodges of people in the emergency medical professions, lodges of people in the professions, lodges of people who are contractors or in the building trades. They need to be lodges that are small and manageable, so that the participation rate is, of course, much higher, because everybody has things in common outside the fraternity. So the creation of new lodges is I think it's a key strategy that all Grand Lodges are going to have to start looking at. It's easier to create a new lodge than it is to change the culture of an existing one. And if that existing lodge is made up primarily of men in their late 70s and 80s, and there's only 6 or 7 guys keeping it open, they don't have the energy to recreate themselves. And so, so one strategy is we just have to make it easier to establish new lodges. And I realize those new lodges are probably going to occur more in the regional economic centers. But again, if we could just keep one active, viable lodge in every county, and focus our attention there, then we can continue to grow Masonry in those areas. So that's the stuff you have to think about, I think, when you're doing Grand Lodge stuff. And Grand Lodges aren't thinking about that, incidentally. So they need to start thinking about it. Yeah.
So just like the general population, then, we're going to see a trend of Masonry urbanizing, right? Mm-hmm. What are the pitfalls or concerns or challenges that you think we'll see as a fraternity as the fraternity urbanizes?
Well, my dream is, my vision is that the Masonic experience will be so unique and so eccentric that men cannot experience it in any other aspect of their life. Because if we can't just become a charitable organization, because there's all kinds of charitable organizations out there, and almost all of them do a much better job than we do. We'll never be able to compete, with charitable organizations. We're not a civic club, we're a fraternity. And so being a fraternity has to be something that feels different and looks different than any other organization that a man might become a part of. And so we have to focus on being a fraternity, and therefore everything that we do has to be of the highest quality that we can make it. And so, we not only have to have a high quality lodge experience, we have to have a high quality of social experiences as men in the lodge, you know, doing things socially together. And so, one model that I think uh, is is becoming more popular and is growing, and and we got this from the European lodge model, and that is the traditional lodges. Uh, bringing back the old traditions, making the tiled space of lodge a truly sacred space. And in order to make it a sacred space, it has to feel like a sacred space. So you got to leave all those profane conversations outside that sacred space. It wouldn't hurt, to use candles and darken rooms and music and all that sort of stuff and even contemplations, so that people that when they're in that sacred space, they are in there to do the inner work, and we're all doing the inner work together. And then we can go have a wonderful dinner, and socialize and all that sort of stuff, which also is another part of a quality experience. I belong to one of those kind of lodges, and we meet once a month, and we and it's an all evening thing. We show up between 5 and 6. Our meetings start at 6, and you know, they're usually over by 7:30. We go out to a nice dining establishment with a private room and enjoy a very, very nice social experience together. And and if you offer that kind of an experience is attractive to men.
That makes sense. What one of the things that we see here with the observant movement is that it's a really good way for um, lodges to kind of revamp their image, revamp what they offer to members or to prospective members. What are some similar ways that that can be applied to, say, the York Rite or the Scottish Rite? The York
Mhm,
Rite, it seems like it's maybe a little bit easier because you say, hey, we have this observant lodge model. The York Rite bodies are structured much like the lodge, so that kind of you can transpose a lot of that fairly easily.
mhm,
And you have some of that, like in AMD, for example, is kind of more of a formal, more elegant experience in
mhm,
many ways.
mhm,
What's
mhm,
but Scottish Rite and the shrine and stuff, those are very large bodies, right? Lots of moving parts. They can't
mhm.
necessarily turn that big of a ship very fast, right?
Yeah.
What are some ways that Masonic organizations of a larger size can implement stuff like that?
Mhm. Well, it's you know, um, all of the concordant bodies of masonry, the degree conferral bodies of masonry, they're under even a greater threat of demise than our blue lodges, because their productivity depends 100% on the productivity of lodges, and so their numbers have declined even more dramatically uh, than our blue lodges numbers have declined. Their strength is that the strength of the Scottish Rite is, of course, that it's not an experience that you have to have every month. You can actually go on these weekend journeys, and you can participate in the degrees of the Scottish Rite over a period of a few weekends, and you can get the lessons of all the degrees, and and that may be enough from a Scottish Rite point of view. Um, you can have social gatherings of Scottish Rite men, but it's not as significant to do that as it is in the Blue Lodges, because it's not local. The Scottish Rite, I don't believe, can survive unless unless it makes the commitment to confer enough of their degrees, its degrees, to satisfy the four quests and themes that we talked about earlier. I have a real fear that those valleys that only confer the 5 obligatory degrees will not be long for the world. But on the other hand, I think the Scottish Rite is clearly the University of Freemasonry, and as long as everybody understands that the philosophy of Freemasonry is in the Scottish Rite, then they just have to make sure that they don't default to becoming a charitable organization or just conferring the mandatory degrees and saying that's enough. And I'm not saying they have to confer all 29, but I would suggest they have to confer a minimum of 13 in order to keep the theme quests alive where they can be discussed. And I think most valleys can handle 13 degrees. I think most valleys can handle a lot more than that, because most of those degree teams come from lodges. And so,
Do you have a specific, when you say 13 degrees, is that just total number of degrees, or do you have a specific 13 in mind?
And of course, 5 of them are the obligatory 5.
Sure.
And I think that the 4th and the 14th are 2 of those 5, and both of those are Lodge of Perfection degrees. I think it's really important to pick up at least 2 more of the Lodge of Perfection degrees in addition to the 4th and 14th, so you can kind of talk about the theme of self-discovery and the ruffian elements, that are in those degrees. And I don't think it makes a lot of difference which 2 of those degrees you confer. But I do think that the 9th and 10th is very, very important if you're a Scottish Rite Mason, because that's when you deal with that. So you got to do, and the 9th and 10th can go together as one.
Yeah.
So I'd say pick up 2 more in addition to the 9th and 10th. So maybe 3 there. I think in the chapter of Rose Croix, you could probably get by with only doing the 18th degree. But in the Council of Kadosh,
there's a wealth of stuff in the council.
Oh my gosh, yes. And the ancient mystery traditions, I mean, the 23rd to the 27th degree or 26 degrees are ancient mystery degrees. You just got to do one of those for sure. So you can talk about the ancient mystery tradition. You can talk about where the initiatic tradition came from. And, the 27th degree is the alchemical degree. I always felt like that's an important degree to do. The knighthood degrees, 28th, 29th, and 30th. You're already doing the 30th. I would pick up 1 more of those, either the 28th or the 29th. And I think the 31st is necessary. So I don't know how many that comes out to, but I think it's around 13. So the 31st is really a very, very important degree because it is a self-examination degree. It really asks the difficult questions that we need to hear every time we meet and reflect on to make sure that that we have indeed transformed ourselves as better men, in the process of doing this. So, I think that would be good for the Scottish Rite. I agree with you. I think the York Rite's strength is its closest to the Blue Lodge degrees. It has the Mark Master tradition, and it's the only body in Freemasonry that offers the Mark Master tradition. It's a tradition that's still conferred by lodges in some countries. It's as you know, it's a degree for a fellowcraft Mason, and so it's a very, very important tradition to know about. Um, they have the roll arch tradition. They have the secret vault tradition. They have the knighthood tradition. And in the chapter and council degrees of the York Rite are both esoterically sound. And that's another way I evaluate I evaluate Freemasonry. Are the degrees esoterically sound? In other words, are there allegories represented in those degrees? Is there hidden information in those degrees that we must discover for ourselves? And so the chapter and council, are critically important. The knighthood, a lot of people argue the Order of the Temple is the most beautiful degree in Freemasonry, and it is a beautiful degree. Certainly the most important of the knighthood degrees of that order. You can receive the Order of Red Cross. You can kind of get that in the Scottish Rite, so you have an option there. You can argue that the Knight of Malta was just thrown in there for some reason, and it wasn't really part of Masonry to begin with. But the 30th degree is our Knight Templar degree in the Scottish Rite. It might be a little more difficult for the York Rite, since that's a Christian order of Freemasonry, and that's there's young men want Freemasonry to be inclusive when it comes to faith systems, and so that represents a bit of a challenge for the York Rite. But chapter and council degrees need to stay in place. They really do, if they can. But not every local body needs to have a chapter, council, commandery. If you just have a chapter, if your local lodge can create a York Rite chapter, then you can create regional York Rite chapters, and then you can feed them into regional festivals where they can continue their experience as a York Rite Mason. So, yeah, I think it's unlikely that a lodge an individual lodge will have the men in place who could confer all the York Rite degrees, locally. I just don't think we're going to be able to do that. So we're going to have that on a regional scale too.
So Robert, if you don't mind, I want to start kind of circling back. In the beginning, when you talked about your journey into Masonry, you spoke about how the Masons were the community, right? They were beyond an integral part of it. They were kind of the linchpin and the organizers and everything that kept everything, on in the community. They sponsored community events. It was almost like an ever-present part of communal life. And then you had also talked about how during the Depression and the that changed over time, over the past couple of generations. The question I have for you is, in our modern world, how everything is, most interactions we have are very transactional. How do you think Masons can build awareness of Masonry in the community, so that way we can start reestablishing ourselves as a part of the wider community that we find ourselves in?
Mm-hmm. Well, we have a wonderful tool, and that's social media. We have wonderful marketing opportunities, like beafreemason.org and all the wonderful stuff that came out of that program, and that can be adaptable to be a texasfreemason.org. We have more and better tools than we ever have had to tell our story and to introduce compelling reasons why men may want to become a part of our organization. And so I don't worry much about being able to put ourselves in front of men. We have the ability to target almost any population of men. but we also have to have the leadership in place to make sure that once a communication is started with someone who has a passing interest or curiosity about Freemasonry, that we continue that communication uh, in, in very thoughtful ways without necessarily tying it to him becoming a Freemason, but just encouraging him to understand what Freemasonry offers any man who wants to join it. And so I don't worry about being able to attract men. And I think, as a matter of fact, I think we could do a lot better job at protecting our West Gate just because of the tools that we have now that we no longer have. The one thing that I've noticed, and I don't know how to make this tie, but we need to figure out how to bridge this gap. Uh, Lodges do a lot of charitable good in their communities. I know in Oklahoma, we through our through our Oklahoma Masonic Charity Foundation, we distribute $6 million a year to community causes all over the state, and almost all of that money is run through local lodges, so that money is always given in the name of Freemasonry. And it has amazed me that as much good, and especially in small towns, many small towns, the Masonic Lodge is depended upon by the community to serve a lot of its nonprofit causes. We don't seem to be able to convert that to member numbers. And I think that's a leadership problem. If we just go back to networking like men used to do in the fraternity, if we're serving good causes in a community, we should be discussing with some of the men that are involved in those causes the importance of representing their cause by becoming a member of the lodge. And we haven't been able to convert our charitable contributions into membership. And I'm not saying that we can't do it. I just haven't figured out how we do it. But I know that the only way it's going to be done is through networking. And part of our challenge is we have a leadership problem in our lodges that we've inherited over a long period of time. We have many men who become masters of lodges who have absolutely no other community experience. They don't have any other leadership experience. And so, maybe instead of trying to spend our time teaching them how to be leaders of lodges, maybe we should incorporate teaching them how to be leaders of men and leaders in the community. Because the thing that the lodges in the earliest part of the 20th century had that we seem to have lost is, they somehow were able to capture the respected men in their communities. And so we need to be focused on capturing the respected men, always need to be focused on capturing the respected men in our communities. And my thinking is that we're simply not talking to most of those men like we used to. Does that make sense?
It does. Well, Brother Davis, we we don't want to keep you too much longer, but we really do appreciate you having come onto the podcast and joined us today. I understand your personal website is robertgdavis.net. That's correct, right?
Yes.
Okay.
That's my books are available on that website. And also, I posted an awful lot of my blogs, just my essays about Freemasonry. And so I know I don't pay a lot of attention to that, but again, kind of the thing I've always done is just I've written reflections about my own thoughts about things concerning the fraternity, and I know that men must appreciate them, because I've heard from men who've thanked me for doing that. But and I know one of the questions you asked that you gave me was had to do with how you become inspired to write a book or something like that. And I think the key for me is I have a creative gift, and I have these creative sparks, and I don't know when they happen, but when they happen, I'll all of a sudden get this idea, and then I just have to write until the idea sort of gets on paper, and so all of those little essays have just been those little creative moments I've had where I've had to sit down and write out my thoughts. And that's the same way I approach the book. So if you have that kind of gift, use it. My gosh, use it. Yeah. People need to hear your thoughts. People need to be able to read what you know. You need to freely share what you know with the outside world, with the Masonic world. And every man has things they can share. And so I just think one of the things about servant leadership is you just should freely give away your knowledge. And if all Masons would just freely share their knowledge, we could all learn together.
I like that philosophy. So, dear listeners, if you would like to purchase some of Brother Davis's books, or read some of his blog posts, and read some of his essays, you can visit him at www.robertgdavis.net. That's all one word. And if y'all want to learn more about Fort Worth Lodge or the podcast, you can find us online at www.fortworth148.org or fortworthlodge.com. We are Fort Worth Lodge 148 on Facebook. And if you want to email us and learn more, you can reach us at info148@fortworth148.org. Texas Masonicon is one of our educational events, and that's coming up this summer in August. If you want to learn more, you can go to texasmasonicon.com. We spell that texasmasonicon.com. And we are Texas Masonicon on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. So, dear listeners, thank you very much for joining us again. And we appreciate y'all joining us on the search for knowledge in all its forms. Thank y'all so much.